I know the Twin Falls Prosecutor released their findings earlier today, so I believe you all have them and folks have seen those. I'm going to briefly just talk a little bit about that, and then talk kind of about what happened on January 23rd, go through that. Talk a little bit about body camera video, what we have, what we know about the body camera video. We'll watch a little bit of video and a little bit of audio, and I'll take any questions that you might have. So just to start out, I just, this is just a great community, and there's so many people that have to help out to do things like this. On the 23rd, when the incident happened, it overwhelmed, well not overwhelmed, but it took everything we had at Idaho Falls Police Department to investigate this and to take care of it. And the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office came out and handled all of our calls for us, and they're just such a help. We wanted to thank them. The Idaho State Police who came, and all of the agencies that are part of that multi-agency task force from all of our region, they just sent their detectives down and did just a really, really good investigation, so I wanted to thank them. The Twin Falls Prosecutor who spent time to review all those reports and give it a thorough analysis in a timely manner. We want to thank him for that. And then when this occurred, I kind of came out and said, hey, could you please give us a little bit of time to do an investigation? We want to get you all the answers. We will get you all those answers, but these things take time. So I really want to thank the McVey family for giving us the time to get those answers. I went out and met with the McVey family along with a couple of other folks, and we talked to them last night and talked to them about everything that we're going to talk about today and gave them all that information. Members of the public that gave us time to finish the investigation before speculating, and a lot of you in the press, thank you for giving us the time to do that and to get you the answers. And now is the day in which we're going to keep those promises we made and get you all those answers. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from the Twin Falls Prosecutor's conclusion. He said, I have concluded after reading the reports, reviewing the evidence, and conferring with the detectives from the Idaho State Police who headed up the Critical Incident Task Force investigation that there is insufficient evidence to support a criminal charge against any law enforcement officers for the January 23, 2018 shooting of Shane McVey. McVey demonstrated aggressive hostility to the officers and a refusal to comply with lawful orders designed to defuse the situation. McVey resisted Officer Lauder's commands to stop and show Officer Lauder his hands, and instead attacked Officer Lauder with pepper spray, which gave Officer Lauder a reasonable fear that he and Sergeant McKenna could have been injured and that McVey could have seized Officer Lauder's pistol, making McVey an even greater danger to officers and the community at large. For these reasons, I decline to file any criminal charges against Officer Lauder or any other officer involved in this incident. So, what occurred, it was January 23rd, 2018. Sean Earl McVey parked his 1986 blue Ford pickup truck at the Common Sense convenience store, which is located at 10003 South Boulevard here in Idaho Falls. The pickup truck had a driver's side rear flat tire. McVey purchased coffee inside the Common Sense, then moved his truck to the back or east side of the building. On later investigation, it appeared that McVey was attempting to change the flat tire and was using a lug wrench and a torch to loosen the lug wrench. I think we have some pictures here so we can kind of take a look at where we're at. So the Common Sense is this one in green, so he's parked in behind the Common Sense there. There was a customer that came into the parking lot of Common Sense, drove into the back parking lot, and observed a man using a blowtorch, what they described as a blowtorch, to the tread section of a tire near the back side of the building, next to the driver's side rear of a blue older truck. The tire that the man was using was not on the truck, and it appeared to this complainant, this witness, that the man was suspicious in doing something he shouldn't. They saw what was a blowtorch, the blowtorch on the tire. They didn't know what they were doing. They thought that was suspicious. The complainant pulled around to the front of the store, parked, and went inside of the store and met with the cashier that was inside the store and let the cashier know what was occurring in the parking lot. The Common Sense cashier called the police about this suspicious activity. Later in the investigation, the cashier told other detectives that she was the only employee working at the time at the store, and that the man, who was later identified as Mr. McVey, had come into the store earlier and had gotten a cup of coffee, which she actually purchased for him. She didn't initially recognize this person as Mr. McVey, but later she did recognize him and who he was because he had done some cement work for the Common Sense several years earlier, so she knew him and who he was. Idaho Falls Police Officer Earl and Idaho Falls Police Sergeant Pat McKenna had completed a disturbance call near the area of the Common Sense. Officer Lauder learned from dispatch that there was a suspicious activity call from the Common Sense and notified dispatch that he would respond to the call since he was close to that area. Officer Lauder arrived at the Common Sense and drove his patrol vehicle to the back or east side of the building where the incident had been reported. Officer Lauder observed a blue Ford pickup truck and a man, who was later identified as Mr. McVey, that appeared to be working on the truck. Officer Lauder asked dispatch for a description of the man reported suspicious and realized that the person that he was seen by the truck was the same as who the complainant had reported as a suspicious person. So he is now in the back of the parking lot. The truck's back there, and Officer Lauder pulls in behind that truck and sees Mr. McVey there in the parking lot. Officer Lauder parked behind the truck and observed the man appeared to be changing a tire. Officer Lauder observed that the rear driver's side tire was low, the man was holding a tire iron, and there were tools all about. When the man, who was later identified as Mr. McVey, saw Officer Lauder, he started to leave. He walked north, turned left, and then walked around the side of the building out of Officer Lauder's view. Officer Lauder gave dispatch the license plate of the truck that was left behind. Officer Lauder did not see anything that appeared like a fire as he got there. He didn't see a blowtorch. He didn't see anything on fire. And so he started to go around the building, to go inside of the Common Sense, to talk to the clerk and the witness that were inside of there. Officer Lauder entered the Common Sense and spoke with the complainant, and he learned that the man, who was later identified as Mr. McVey, had left the area and was last seen on Corner Avenue as he was leaving. Officer Lauder returned to his patrol car and proceeded in the direction that McVey had last been seen. Officer Lauder learned that the license plate on the truck showed that the registered owner is Sean McVey. Officer Lauder ran McVey on his computer and obtained a photograph of McVey. Officer Lauder recognized McVey's name. Officer Lauder hadn't personally interacted with McVey in a law enforcement setting before, but he had heard from other law enforcement officers who had interacted with him before. Officer Lauder broadcast via police radio that McVey had taken off on foot and was last seen on Corner Avenue. Officer Lauder proceeded towards McVey's last observed location and learned from dispatch that McVey had felony warrants. Officer Lauder heard that he had warrants. There were multiple warrants out from his arrest, so he knew he had warrants. Officer Lauder began to search for Mr. McVey because of McVey's warrants for his arrest and to investigate why he had been reported as starting a fire behind the Common Sense. Officer Lauder parked his patrol vehicle on Corner Ave facing south near a dumpster, got out of his patrol car, and began walking south on the sidewalk between Corner Avenue and the apartment building located at 1098 South Boulevard, searching for McVey. So can we go to the next one there? So he's coming down here, and he's going to end up coming up in this little breezeway here. So he parks, walks down here, looking at the snow that's on the side there. He sees fresh tracks that he thinks might be from him. He follows them into that little alley breezeway. Officer Lauder began looking in the snow on the sidewalk for tracks. Officer Lauder saw fresh tracks going southbound. The tracks led into a carport between two buildings, and Officer Lauder saw a gathering of footprints in front of a door that was not sitting on its hinges correctly. The door had been taken off the hinges. It looked like someone had forced entry through that door. The door appeared to be leaning upright and looked like it had been broken. Officer Lauder heard rustling sounds and movement coming from behind the door. Officer Lauder opened the door, which opened to a set of stairs that led down into a basement. There were no lights in the basement, and it was relatively dark. Officer Lauder shined his flashlight down the stairs. Officer Lauder announced that he was with the Idaho Falls Police and gave verbal commands for the person in the basement to show themselves. Officer Lauder requested another officer to respond via police radio because of the open door down into the basement. So he's back in here now. He walks back here. If we can go to the diagram now, please. He comes down in here through this breezeway area. There's door right here is the door that was off its hinges. That door comes open. He's standing right here at the very top of the stairs where the sun is out and is bright, and you can hear the movement down at the bottom of the stairs into that basement where it's very dark down into that basement. Sergeant Pat McKenna had been in the area also looking for McVey and arrived within a few seconds. Sergeant McKenna parked his patrol car on Corner Avenue facing north and exited his patrol car and walked toward the carport alleyway where Officer Lauder was. Sergeant McKenna could see Officer Lauder in the breezeway near the doorway to the basement, which was open at that time. Officer Lauder had his service pistol out and was standing in the open doorway in front of the door giving verbal commands. Due to Officer Lauder having his pistol out and the fact that the police officers would not be going into the basement at that time, they were holding their position at the top of the stairs, Sergeant McKenna decided to deploy his department-issued taser. Sergeant McKenna felt that if Mr. McVey was uncooperative, they wanted to be able to gain control of him and keep him from harming the officers. The way we train them is if one of them has a pistol or a handgun or some sort of firearm, the other one will have some sort of less than lethal tool, so we have the options of using everything at the time, and that's what Sergeant McKenna did, and he relays that information to Officer Lauder that they have both options available. Officer Lauder continued to give verbal commands. Sergeant McKenna removed and activated his taser, believing that Mr. McVey would attempt to fight with the officers. Officer Lauder looked back down the stairs, announced again, and McVey stepped into the view at the bottom of the stairwell. McVey had an aggressive stance. McVey had his left hand up, so his left hand was up, and his right hand was down. They don't know if it was behind his back or just down because it was so dark at that point. The right hand was down, and they couldn't see what was in that right hand. Mr. McVey was leaning forward and looking up at Officer Lauder. McVey started up the stairs deliberately and with intent. Officer Lauder continued to give verbal commands for Mr. McVey to stop and to show his hands, which were still obscured down to the side of his leg. Mr. McVey started up the stairs, and Officer Lauder told McVey again to stop. McVey continued up the stairs, and Officer Lauder continued to give verbal commands for McVey to stop and to show his hands. Mr. McVey paused about halfway up the stairs, still maintaining a very forward stance. McVey had his left hand up, and his right hand at this point was now behind his back. Officer Lauder told Mr. McVey to slowly show him his hand from behind his back. Mr. McVey's stance and the look on his face made Officer Lauder feel like he was not going to comply. Mr. McVey had an aggressive look and an aggressive posture as described by Officer Lauder. Sergeant McKenna arrived next to Officer Lauder, turned and looked into the stairwell. Sergeant McKenna saw Mr. McVey was about 5 steps from being at the top of the stairwell. Mr. McVey's torso was moved forward and he was charging up towards the top step. Sergeant McKenna immediately disengaged the safety mechanism on his taser. Mr. McVey charged up those last several steps, covering the last few steps very quickly. Mr. McVey never said anything to the officers. McVey brought his right hand out and around, so the hand was concealed behind the back. He brought his right hand out and around towards Officer Lauder. Officer Lauder could see in that hand a canister in McVey's right hand, and he saw a stream coming out of that canister of a liquid coming towards him. Officer Lauder assumed the liquid stream was pepper spray. Officer Lauder believed when McVey reached the top of the stairs and tried to hit him with the pepper spray that McVey was going to try to overtake Officer Lauder. Officer Lauder felt that Mr. McVey's goal was going to be to fight with him and try and take his gun, which was already out, since it was already out of the holster. Officer Lauder shot McVey, firing 1 round from his department-issued Glock 17 9mm pistol. Officer Lauder, after the shot was fired, took 1 step to the right as Sergeant McKenna was to his left. Sergeant McKenna broadcast via police radio that shots had been fired and then entered the stairwell. Officer Lauder moved into the stairwell behind Sergeant McKenna. The officers continued to give Mr. McVey commands. Mr. McVey had fallen down to the bottom of the stairs at this point. As he was lying at the bottom of the stairs, his leg was partially on the last couple of stairs, with the rest of him on the floor. Mr. McVey was still not listening to the officers. The view of McVey's left hand was obscured at this point. It was hidden underneath him. And they continued to give him commands to show his hand. Eventually, McVey brought both of his hands to his chest, and the officers proceeded towards Mr. McVey at that time. Sergeant McKenna then pulled Mr. McVey off of the stairs and laid him on the floor of the basement. Officer Lauder held security on the rest of the basement, which had not been cleared yet. Almost immediately thereafter, Officer Brandon Prince and several other officers arrived from the Idaho Falls Police Department to assist at the scene. Officer Prince, having had medical training in armed forces, instructed Sergeant McKenna to begin chest compressions or CPR while he put some latex gloves on. Officer Prince took over CPR from Sergeant McKenna. Officer Prince could not find a pulse. Officer Prince cut the clothing off of Mr. McVey to expose his chest. Officer Prince checked to see where the blood was coming from. Officer Prince continued CPR and instructed another officer to retrieve his medical bag from his patrol car. Officer Prince had a tourniquet and put a tourniquet on Mr. McVey's arm and continued CPR until the Idaho Falls Fire Department paramedics arrived on scene and took over CPR. Mr. McVey was transported from the scene by ambulance to the Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead when he got there. As part of the investigation that was done, the investigators interviewed 3 police officers, 12 witnesses, and 32 responding officers who responded and took reports. From the state police report, they reached this as a conclusion. The investigation has found no evidence of criminal action on the part of the law enforcement officers involved. Officers from the Idaho Falls Police Department were lawfully engaged in the apprehension of Sean Earl McVey for questioning and arrest after learning that McVey had outstanding warrants and was the subject in a call for service from the cashier at Common Sense convenience store about a suspicious person possibly attempting to light a fire. Officers were authorized to use all reasonable necessary means to effect the arrest and are justified in using deadly force to overcome resistance when having probable cause to believe the resistance poses a threat of death or serious physical injury to the officers or other persons. Officers were identifiable as law enforcement and were shouting commands at McVey when they located him in the basement at the apartment building located at 1098 South Boulevard. Inside the basement area where Mr. McVey was located, a second set of stairs was located on the north end, opposite to the stairs that Officer Lauder was at. The stairs led to a door that could only be opened from inside the building, not the basement area. Mr. McVey resisted Officer Lauder's commands to stop and show Officer Lauder his hands. Mr. McVey used a can of pepper spray to assault officers, which could have resulted in physical injury to Officer Lauder and Sergeant McKenna. The use of the pepper spray on the officers could have allowed McVey to fight and disarm Officer Lauder, which could have resulted in serious physical injury and death to the officers. Officer Lauder had a reasonable fear that Mr. McVey was going to overtake him and take his gun. Officer Lauder thought McVey was going to try and fight with him and try to take his gun. Officer Lauder also felt McVey might try to kill him and Sergeant McKenna. Officer Lauder has been sprayed by pepper spray previously in training, and he described his personal physical reaction to pepper spray as incapacitating. And they come to the conclusion that Mr. McVey posed a threat to Officer Lauder's safety and the safety of Sergeant McKenna. A lot of questions about body camera, what there is. Sergeant McKenna and Officer Lauder did not have body cameras on them when this event occurred, so there is no body camera footage of the event itself. The next arriving officers did have body cameras, and so we have video and audio of what occurred post-shooting as they went down and they cleared the basement and tried to give CPR and life-saving measures to Mr. McVey. There's in-car camera footage of Officer Lauder arriving on the scene and where he goes, and there's security camera footage of Mr. McVey leaving the Common Sense and going to the area where he was at. So those are the videos that we have and that we know are there. So we're going to look at a couple pictures and play a couple of videos for you. I will do my best to narrate this as it goes on. So this is the parking lot across the street. This is going to be the breezeway where it occurred. This is video surveillance footage looking into it. You're going to see Mr. McVey come through the parking lot here as he's leaving the area after he sees Officer Lauder go into the Common Sense. He goes back in between the two buildings, up in the top there. He goes off the camera. That's when he accesses that door and goes down into the basement. This is Officer Lauder responding and arriving in that area. He's going to park his car right here along the side of the building. Right back here is where Mr. McVey went. Officer Lauder is going to come out of the car. You'll see him walking slowly as he's looking at the snow, the footprints in the snow, and he's going to go back down that alley to where he sees the additional footprints that are going to end up in front of that door. Approaching slowly and cautiously, trying to find where he went. This is the area right back there. This is where the footprints initially were. There's a lot more footprints now because the officers have been there. And this is the door going down where you go down into that basement area. This is a look down at the basement. So this view is where Officer Lauder and McKenna would have been, looking down on the basement. You see it's very bright up where the officers were. As you get down on the basement, it's very dark, and that's where they first encountered Mr. McVey. Officers up at the top of the stairs. They never left that top of the stair area. They remained there. It was Mr. McVey that charged them and initiated the contact going up the stairs. This is down inside that basement. You see how dark it is down there. This is the area which they were operating in. That's the set of stairs that went up out of the basement that had access to the rest of those buildings that they saw. Again, it's really dark down in that basement where they were trying to contact Mr. McVey. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have at this time. Yes, sir.
Why were the officers not wearing body cams at the time?
So we don't have enough body cameras for all of our officers. We've got about enough body cameras to cover about half of our patrol officers, and so they just didn't have them. We don't have enough for everybody. The cameras that we did have, the battery wasn't lasting, and they were back on the charger. It's just we don't have enough equipment for all the officers to have cameras at all times.
Chief, was there a note then found in his car? Was it found in the car, or where was that note where he expressed some outrage at police?
He sent a note to a prosecutor's office, and it was the Bingham County Prosecutor's Office, I believe, if I got that right, the Bingham County Prosecutor's Office. My understanding is the warrant that he had out for his arrest, the felony warrant, was generated out of that office. And so he sent a note to that office stating that he was unhappy with the charge, and that if they, I believe it says something on the phone, if you send the boys in blue after me, I'm going to die, was the gist of it. So that note had gone to the prosecutor's office, and he was stating that he would not be taken alive, and that note is what it said. I believe the actual verbiage is in the copy of the prosecutor's report that they released earlier. So that kind of goes to his intent. The officers, what they saw was that he was charging up the stairs, and the officers felt like they were under violent attack. He pulled out the pepper spray, tried to spray them with pepper spray. They believed he was trying to kill them. From the note he sent and the other stuff we can learn, it appears that that was indeed his intent, and that what the officers were seeing was in fact what he was trying to do.
So you believe it was he was trying suicide by cop?
We think he was attacking the officers and trying to injure the officers. He had said that he would not go back to prison. He would not be taken alive, was what he had said. And so, his intent was to continue to go until the officers had to shoot him, and he would continue. That's what we believe the intent was, and that's what the officers saw was occurring. That's kind of what the note described. And so that's what we think was happening. Yes, sir?
Did either of the officers know about this letter?
No, not at the time. They did not.
How is Officer Lauder holding up after this event? When will they be cleared to return to service?
You know, these things are just tragic for everyone, right? So it's tough on the family, Mr. McVey's family. It's really hard on them. We went out and met with them last night. And so there's a lot of bad information going out about their loved one, their family member, about some of his stuff. And they remember him as dad. They remember the good stuff, and that's what they want to remember. So it's really hard on them. It's incredibly hard on the officers and the officers' family. It's not easy to do that. It's difficult. It stays with you the rest of your life. When the event actually occurred, we had a psychologist, a psychiatrist come out and talk to the officers involved to let them know what the common physiological reactions will be after these events. So they knew what to expect, and I think that helped out. We do a thing called a critical incident stress debriefing, which we bring the officers together and the other people involved, dispatchers, everyone is involved in it. We let them talk about what occurred, and so that happened. So Officer Lauder, I've talked to him several times, as other officers have as well. He's had all that. We'll give him the opportunity again to talk to the doctor before he comes back to work and make sure he's ready to come back. And as soon as he's ready to come back, we'll put him back to work.
Any idea when that will be?
He was working the 4th of July and had a bicycle injury from that work, and so he had another surgery he had to have done, and so he's going to be injured for just a little bit longer. So it will take longer for that to heal than for us to clear this up. So he'll be back whenever he's filling up to it. I imagine it would be 6 weeks before that gets healed, but he's good to come back at any point now.
Just so I'm clear, Sergeant McKenna went to deploy his taser. Before he was able to do that, the other officer fired his gun.
That is correct. So Sergeant McKenna had the taser on it, and he activated the taser, which shows the taser has 2 prongs that come out, and there's a laser sight that shows where both prongs are going to hit. You have to get both prongs to make contact in order for it to work. So if I understand correctly, he had one of the dots lined up, but not the other one. But Sergeant McKenna was standing to the left, and Officer Lauder was standing to the right. So Officer Lauder had the view down and could see what Mr. McVey was doing with his hand. Sergeant McKenna could not see that as he was watching from what was going on. So as Sergeant McKenna was watching, he couldn't see that the hand was obscured. He couldn't see the can of pepper spray come up. He didn't see all that stuff. That's why Officer Lauder reacted when he did, because he could see what was occurring and saw the stream of pepper spray. Even though Sergeant McKenna couldn't see all that stuff, he had expressed that he thought he was under violent attack as well and made the decision to fire his taser. And I believe he said had he had a gun in his hand, he would have fired that as well, because he felt he was under violent attack, is how he described it.
And this all happened in a matter of 10
Quick.
seconds, 5 seconds?
The last charge up the stairs was instantaneous. It was a short period of time from bottom of the stairs coming up to the top of the stairs, and that last charge was a violent bull rush attack of the officers.
And he was shot in what part of his body?
It was so as he's coming up, he's got the can of pepper spray up as he's pepper spraying him, and the round hits the shoulder as he's coming up. So it hits the shoulder, so through and through the shoulder and enters his torso. It was one round initially went through the soldier. So he's bladed off to him as he's attacking the officers with his hand up, and with the angle coming down, it went down through.
You mentioned that Officer Lauder had heard about McVey from other officers. What exactly did Lauder know about him?
He had not interacted with him before, so he knew he had warrants. He knew the warrants were out for his arrest. He knew he had warrants. So, other questions? Yes.
I understand there's going to be an internal review now that the investigation and prosecution team are complete. Do you know when that will begin and how long it will take?
We've been doing that internal review since it commenced, so we have most of the documentation done. The last steps of that will be to present that information to a panel. That panel consists of the patrol captain, who's over Officer Lauder, a couple other police officers, and a pair of civilians who will be on that panel. They'll get presented with the information. They'll send me a little report about what they think as far as our internal policies and things going on. I'll get that. I imagine that will just take another couple of weeks.
Was anything done wrong here? Is there anything that, you know, if you were to go through it again, that you might do differently?
So let me make a universal statement, then I'm going to answer that question as a no. But the universal statement is we always look at everything we do and look at how we can do things better. That is a universal statement. So yes, we're going to do that. Having said that, everything that occurred, we're always reacting to what the other person is doing. Given everything the officers knew, what they saw, what was occurring, they acted as they were trained and supposed to do. Yes, sir.
You said that the round went through the shoulder and into the torso. Now, what is the official cause of death? How did that end up killing him?
I don't have that answer right off the top of my head. It was that gunshot. There was also, I believe the report said that methamphetamine and things like that were also on board, were contributing factors to the death, but it was the gunshot wound that killed him.